Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. Okay, let's go. The faceless portraits. Art had always been my escape, a way to pour out emotions I couldn't express otherwise. But lately, even painting couldn't save me from the creeping despair. My bills piled up on the kitchen counter, taunting me with every passing day. Commissions were non-existent, and my so-called gallery exhibition last month had been a colossal failure. So, when I stumbled upon the flea market on the edge of town, I saw it as a sign. Maybe I'd find inspiration in its chaos of forgotten things. As I wandered through the rows of trinkets, a tattered sign caught my attention. Art supplies, vintage and rare. The vendor, a wiry man with deep-set eyes, sat behind a makeshift stall littered with brushes, cracked palettes, and ancient tubes of oil paint. At the edge of the display was a stack of blank canvases wrapped in brittle brown paper. "Those," he said in a voice like gravel, "belong to an artist who painted dreams, or nightmares depending on how you see it." I chuckled nervously. "How much for the lot?" His lips twisted into a thin smile. $20, but fair warning. Once you start, you can't stop." It sounded like nonsense, but I handed over the cash without a second thought. The canvases had a certain pull, as if they were waiting for me. That night, I unwrapped one of the canvases in my small studio apartment. The texture was smooth, almost unnervingly so, and seemed to shimmer faintly under the dim light. It felt alive under my fingers. I set to work, letting the strokes flow freely. For the first time in months, I felt a surge of inspiration. The hours melted away as I painted, lost in a trance. By the time I stepped back, my back aching from hunching over, the canvas bore a hauntingly beautiful landscape, misty hills under a blood-red sky. Satisfied, I left the painting to dry and collapsed into bed. The next morning, I stumbled into the studio, rubbing sleep from my eyes. My stomach dropped when I saw the canvas. The misty hills were still there, but something had changed. A figure now stood in the foreground, shrouded in shadow. It was faceless, its head a blank oval. I blinked, convinced I was imagining things. My paints were still on the table, untouched since last night. I hadn't painted that figure. "Stress," I muttered to myself, forcing a laugh. "It's messing with my head." I brushed it off and grabbed another canvas, eager to distract myself. This time, I painted a serene forest scene. But when I returned to it the following morning, a faceless figure had appeared again, standing among the trees. The third canvas was the breaking point. I painted a cityscape at twilight, vibrant and bustling. But by dawn, a group of faceless figures stood in the shadows of the buildings, their blank heads tilted as if watching me. I tried to stop painting, but the urge was unbearable. It wasn't just inspiration, it was compulsion. The canvases seemed to call to me, whispering promises of greatness if I kept going. Each night, I painted, and each morning, the faceless figures multiplied. They grew clearer, their postures more defined. Some raised hands, as if reaching for me. The first time I saw one outside the canvas, I thought I was losing my mind. It was late, and I was brushing my teeth when I noticed movement in the bathroom mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it. A faceless figure standing just behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but the bathroom was empty. The next night, I caught a glimpse of one in the window as I worked, its featureless face pressed against the glass. By the end of the week, they were everywhere, reflections in the TV screen, shadows on the walls, always watching, always closer. Desperate for answers, I returned to the flea market, but the vendor's store was gone. No one remembered him, and I couldn't find a trace of his existence. I decided to destroy the canvases. I stacked them in the alley behind my apartment and set them ablaze. The fire roared, consuming the paintings until nothing remained but ash. For the first time in days, I felt relief. I thought it was over. That night, I woke to the sound of whispers. My studio door creaked open, though I knew I had locked it. In the dim moonlight, I saw them, faceless figures spilling out of the shadows, their heads cocked unnaturally to one side. They surrounded my bed, their blank faces inches from mine. "You can't stop," a voice hissed. It didn't come from any of them, but from everywhere at once. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I woke, the figures were gone, but the canvases were back in my studio, pristine and blank, as if they had never been burned. Now, I can't leave. Every time I try, I end up back here, in front of the canvases. My phone doesn't work, and the windows show only darkness. I paint because I have no choice. The figures are in the room with me now, watching, waiting. The only thing keeping them at bay is the art. But I'm running out of canvases, and I don't know what will happen when the last one is gone. The Sleeping Town. When I arrived in the town of Belhaven, it felt like a place stuck in time. The streets were too quiet, the air too still. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods, Belhaven was picturesque, quaint shops, cobblestone streets, and an old clock tower that chimed at the top of every hour. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. I'd moved here to get away from the chaos of the city, renting a small apartment above a bakery owned by a cheerful older couple, Martha and Jim. They welcomed me warmly, as did the rest of the town. Belhaven had a population of just over 1,000, and everyone seemed to know each other. At first, the peacefulness was a relief, but there was something off. The townsfolk were polite but distant, their smiles never reaching their eyes. Whenever I asked about the town's history, they would change the subject or give vague answers. I chalked it up to small-town quirks. But then came the night of the sleep. It started on a Friday evening. The bakery downstairs had closed early, so I decided to take a walk through the empty streets. The sky was a deep indigo, the stars brilliant and unpolluted by city lights. As I passed the clock tower, I noticed something strange. The streets were completely deserted. Even the few night owls who usually lingered in the tavern were nowhere to be seen. Every window was dark. The town felt dead. When I returned to my apartment, I found Martha and Jim slumped over the counter, motionless. "Jim! Martha!" I called out, panic bubbling in my chest. No response. I ran to them and shook their shoulders. Their breathing was shallow but steady. They weren't dead. They were asleep. But no amount of shouting or shaking could wake them. I sprinted to the street and pounded on doors, yelling for help. Every house I entered was the same. Families sprawled in their chairs, children curled up in their beds, all in an unshakable slumber. I was alone. The first night was the worst. I locked myself in my apartment, unsure of what to do. I tried calling for help, but there was no signal. The landline in the bakery was dead, and my car wouldn't start. The roads leading out of town seemed endless, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. At midnight, the clock tower chimed. The sound was sharper than usual, like a knife cutting through the silence. Then the whispers started. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder as the night deepened. I pressed my ear to the walls, trying to locate the source, but the whispers came from everywhere. When I peeked out the window, I saw movement. Shapes flitted through the shadows, too fast to make out. My heart raced as I backed away, drawing the curtains tight. By the second day, I realized the sleepers had changed. Martha and Jim were still breathing, but their skin was pale and clammy. I noticed faint marks on their arms, symbols etched into their flesh like brands. The symbols looked ancient, spiraling patterns and jagged lines. Desperate for answers, I rifled through their things, hoping to find a clue. In a drawer under the counter, I found an old journal. The pages were yellowed and filled with handwriting I couldn't decipher, but one passage stood out. The sleep comes every 50 years. A price must be paid. As the hours passed, the whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. The symbols on the sleeper's skin seemed to pulse, glowing faintly in the dark. I decided to leave. I didn't care how far I had to walk. I couldn't stay in Belhaven another second. But when I stepped outside, I realized the town had changed. The streets twisted in impossible ways, leading me back to where I started no matter which direction I went. The forest loomed, its trees unnaturally tall and dense, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sky. And then I saw them. Figures stood at the edge of the woods, just beyond the streetlights. They were tall and gaunt, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They didn't move, but I felt their gaze, heavy and cold. By the second night, I was losing my grip on reality. The whispers turned into voices, low and guttural. They spoke in unison, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, too quick to catch. I barricaded myself in the apartment, clutching a kitchen knife. At midnight, the clock tower chimed again, louder than before. This time, the sleepers moved. Martha and Jim sat up, their eyes open but unseeing. They stood and began walking, their movements stiff and mechanical. I followed them, heart pounding, as they joined the others in the streets. Every sleeper in town was there, forming a procession that marched toward the woods. I stayed hidden, watching from the shadows. As they reached the forest's edge, the hooded figures stepped forward, meeting the procession. The sleepers knelt, bowing their heads, and the hooded ones placed their hands on their foreheads. One by one, the sleepers vanished, dissolving into wisps of smoke that drifted into the night sky. When the 48 hours ended, the town woke as if nothing had happened. The symbols on their skin had faded, and no one remembered a thing. Martha greeted me cheerfully, completely unaware of the events. But I remembered. I tried to warn them, to tell them what I'd seen, but they dismissed me. "You're just tired," they said. "Get some rest." That night, I packed my things and left Belhaven, determined to put the nightmare behind me. But the symbols haunted me. They appeared in my dreams, carved into the walls of unfamiliar rooms. And no matter how far I traveled, I felt the whispers in the wind, calling me back. I realized the truth too late. I wasn't a visitor to Belhaven. I was its next sleeper. The Bone Collector's Bargain. When we moved to Red Willow, I thought it was the perfect place to settle down. Quiet, picturesque, and tucked away in the mountains, it seemed like the kind of town where you could breathe easy. My wife, Danielle, and I had been looking for a fresh start for ourselves and our 6-year-old daughter, Molly. Life in the city had worn us thin, and the idea of raising Molly in a peaceful, small-town environment felt like the right call. Our house was a charming Victorian at the end of Chestnut Lane, with ivy climbing up the sides and a creaky old porch that Danielle adored. The locals were friendly, though a bit peculiar. They were kind enough, but there was something about the way their smiles lingered a second too long, or how their voices dropped when they talked about the town's traditions. We first heard about the bone collector from our neighbour, Mr. Fennell. He was an older man with a wiry frame and sharp, probing eyes. He showed up on our doorstep a week before the fall equinox, holding a basket of freshly baked bread. "You're new here, so I'll give you some advice," he said, his voice gravelly yet warm. "During the equinox, you'll want to leave a little something on your porch. A trinket, a charm, anything of personal value. It's tradition." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "What kind of tradition?" Mr. Fennell hesitated, his gaze darting toward the trees swaying in the cool autumn breeze. "It's for the bone collector," he said finally. "Every equinox, we leave offerings to keep him satisfied. One year, someone didn't, and we lost them." I laughed, thinking it was some quaint small-town superstition. But Danielle wasn't so sure. "Every place has its quirks," I said as we unpacked Molly's toys later that day. "It's probably just a way to keep kids from misbehaving." Danielle frowned. "It feels more serious than that. Maybe we should play along, just in case." But I waved her off. I wasn't about to indulge in a ritual that felt straight out of a campfire ghost story. The equinox arrived colder than expected. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves. I noticed that every house on the street had small items on their porches: an old locket, a child's doll, even a polished rock. It was eerie, seeing those offerings lined up like a row of sentinels. Our porch, however, remained bare. That night, we put Molly to bed, her favourite stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. The wind had picked up, and the creaks of the old house sounded louder than usual. Danielle shot me a worried glance as we sat in the living room, the TV murmuring in the background. "Are you sure we shouldn't have left something out?" she asked. "Danielle, it's fine," I said. "We're not going to let some old superstition dictate how we live." The first sound came around midnight. A faint, rhythmic tapping against the front door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Danielle turned toward the noise, her eyes wide. "Probably just the wind," I whispered, though I wasn't so sure. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Molly called out from her room upstairs, her small voice trembling. "Daddy! Mommy! Someone's knocking!" I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. When I opened the door, the porch was empty, the wind carrying leaves across the steps. We went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The house felt alive with sound, footsteps creaking along the floorboards, the distant rattle of something in the attic. Danielle shook me awake around 3 a.m., her face pale. "Listen," she whispered. I strained my ears and heard it, a faint rattling, like dry bones clinking together. It was coming from above us. "Stay here with Molly," I said, grabbing the flashlight again. The attic was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made your breath fog up. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing dusty boxes and cobwebbed corners. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then I heard it again. The rattling. It was closer now, coming from the far end of the attic. My heart pounded as I approached, every step feeling heavier than the last. In the corner, I saw it. A pile of bones, arranged in a disturbingly deliberate way, almost like an altar. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Something moved in the shadows, just beyond the beam of light. It was a figure, tall and thin, its shape barely discernible. Its head tilted toward me, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze, cold, piercing and hungry. I ran. Back in the bedroom, I locked the door and tried to explain what I'd seen. Danielle's face drained of color as I spoke, her hands clutching Molly tightly. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. We packed in a frenzy, grabbing only what we could carry. As we loaded Molly into the car, the wind outside grew louder, almost howling. The shadows around the house seemed to move, stretching and twisting unnaturally. When I turned the ignition, the car wouldn't start. I tried again and again, but the engine refused to catch. The rattling grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of dragging footsteps. In the rearview mirror, I saw them, shapes emerging from the trees, their forms skeletal and warped. Danielle screamed as the figures surrounded the car, their bony hands scraping against the windows. I don't remember how we got out of there. Everything became a blur of terror and adrenaline. The next thing I knew, we were running down the street, the sound of rattling bones chasing us. We pounded on Mr. Fennell's door, and he let us in without a word. "You didn't leave an offering, did you?" he asked, his tone accusatory. I shook my head, unable to speak. Mr. Fennell handed us a small wooden charm and muttered something under his breath. "Leave this at your house. It's your only chance." I didn't question him. I ran back to the house, Danielle and Molly close behind, and left the charm on the porch. The rattling stopped. The wind died down. For a moment, everything was still. But as we stood there, catching our breath, I noticed something on the ground. It was a single, pale finger bone. We moved out of Red Willow the next day. I don't know if the bone collector was satisfied or if it's still waiting for us to make another mistake. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of bones rattling, and I wonder if we truly escaped.
You've heard the horrors. Subscribe if you want to keep the spirits on your side. Until next time, pleasant dreams.